Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, everything that rises must converge. Originally, on designing this podcast, I had hoped that I would be able to make Mythic Europe easier for players who haven't enjoyed Ars Magica to venture into. I don't really feel I've been succeeding with that because, somewhat self-indulgently, I've been wandering off into the links between Mythic European ideas and later European philosophy. This episode is the worst example of that, so if you're here because you'd like to learn how Ars Magica works, choose any other episode. Okay, so time to beat to death the idea that the purpose of this podcast is to introduce Mythic Europe to people who haven't played the game before. Let's go for our deepest dive yet into Mythic Europe's cosmology and eschatology. In Mythic Europe, we have the following features in the vanilla game. The Magi who best understand how the clockwork of reality moves are the Kriaman Magi. These Magi are followers of Empedoclean thought in Greek, Sufi, and Helleno-Buddhist modes. Empedocles said that time was a circle, beginning with a paradise, a metaphorical cosmic egg, which he called the Spharios, and returning to that Spharios after eons of strife. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Zoroastrians are roughly correct about the nature of the divine in Mythic Europe, therefore there will be a judgment. Time is not a circle. The Kriaman are wrong. Despite all this, the Kriaman know a lot of cool stuff and can do a lot of cool stuff because they kind of grasp how some of the machinery behind the stage dressing of reality works. There's a way to pull Kriaman mysticism and game mechanics almost intact into the Judeo-Christian framework. Doing so redefines what the point of magic is, and it might give us a new way of looking at many of the other houses in the game. It's also somewhere that we've almost gone before. When I was back in university decades ago, oh my goodness, I'm old, I noticed that the origin story given for mortal magic in Order of Hermes for 2nd edition was very similar to the destruction of the Tainu in Julian May's Pliocene Exile stories. Those stories are prequels and sequels to her Galactic Milieu series, and I love them. A key point in them is that, in broad terms, a Jesuit paleontologist called Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was right about the fundamental nature of reality. I've only ever read his name. I don't believe I've ever even said it before, so apologies for any mispronunciation. De Chardin was a scientist who believed in evolution, and he was also a theologian who believed in God, and his way of bridging those two beliefs is what interests us as a game cosmology. He believed that evolution started early. His force toward coherence he calls love, which is handy because that's what the Kriaman call their force toward coherence. Initially, matter is formed, then it becomes more complex and becomes the dead earth, the geosphere. Out of the elements in the dead earth, life emerges, creating the biosphere. Out of the live elements of the biosphere, self-reflective life emerges, creating the noosphere. That's us, creating thought and culture. Evolution does not stop there. Out of the noosphere will emerge ultrahumans, not only more intelligent, but more ethical than us, driven by love into increasingly complex forms, until as the universe collapses, it is transcended. All matter, time, power, information, and wisdom exist in a single omniscience. That's called the Omega Point. To a Kriaman magus, the Omega Point looks an awful lot like the Spharios. To a Christian, if you describe a spiritual force that exists in everything, knows everything, and can control everything, you're basically describing God. De Chardin takes it one step further and notes that since it's God materially embodied, that's Jesus. This is the second coming, in some sense. So House Kriaman are building a genius locus in their cave complex in the metaphysical heart of the world. Is it easier to say they're building a mechanism which allows Magi to ascend from the human to the ultra-human? that Magi in Twilight are not trapped in a void, waiting for Gabriel to blow his trumpet, but are drawing the universe towards its final unity. A superficial argument against this, and it's one that I wrote, is that the power which drives magic is caused by the decay of the universe towards the swirl of chaos predicted by the Epidean cosmology, and demons are the inhabitants of the final swirl. Purdo is easier than Creo because the world is decaying, entropy increases, giving time direction, and giving magic polarity. Desjardins would argue that there are two types of energy. The physical energy of the world is decaying, but that's not important. The spiritual energy of the world is continuing to become more and more complex, leading eventually to a transcendence of the material. Creo is hard because you're not as good at it as Purdo. Ultrahumans might be. Arguably, they might find Purdo difficult, given that they embody a higher form of wisdom than current humans. It's not that the world's falling apart, it's that Magi have yet to rise. This lets me sneak reason as an idea back into the game, not as the paltry denial of actual facts that it was last time, but in the way it was used during the Scientific Enlightenment, as an obvious way of exploring the creation. As a side note, there are some people who follow Desjardins' ideas who see his work not so much as a spiritual as a mechanistic thing. The cosmological Jesus is basically a supercomputer. These people tend to suggest that because the end is already known, the preconditions that lead to the end are implacable. That is, in a sense, everything is destined. The machine creates itself, ab initio. God comes from fire and goes back to fire. The Kremen have the shackles of the goddess of inevitability as their house sign. Those of you who've played Over the Edge will know that such a machine already exists in one of Atlas's games, the Throckmorton device. In that setting, it is forcing the present to curve toward the future in which it becomes real. Jesus is like the Throckmorton device, but he loves you, so maybe that's okay. So let's look at the realms. The divine are the elements of creation which are closest to the Omega point. Magic is a catalyst that can be used to speed humans toward that point by leading them toward being ultrahumans. Magic is information. Information is love. Fairies are made of stories, and stories are a reserve of the spiritual complexity that is produced as love increases. And the infernal is, I'd argue, it's a result of a Felix culpa. It exists so that the Omega point is more than just Adam, Eve, and some shrubs. Drawing on the Jewish idea that all evil comes from God because everything comes from God, rather than the evil is an absence model, we could posit that the infernal's function is to force the universe to experience itself. To draw Empedocles back into the discussion, he thought the Spharios cracked because of his personal sin, and that the point of reality was its expiation. Anyway, maybe the point of the infernal is to enhance creation, to make the final state of the Spharios more complex than it would be without evil having stirred love around on the way to getting to the final state. So, if you want to play a Kremen or a Holy Magus, and you don't want to use the cosmology that we've used before, maybe a little Desjardins can show you new ways to explore the underlying structure of mythic Europe. Your saga may vary.